Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. After working double shifts at the factory for 3 years and saving every penny I could, I finally achieved my dream of home ownership. The house wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. A modest 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet suburban neighborhood that had been around since the 1980s. What really sold me on the place wasn't just the updated kitchen or the finished basement, but the unique lot shape that came with it. The property had your standard driveway leading to the garage, but right next to it was this perfect 15-foot wide gravel patch that extended along the side of the house. The previous owner had used it for parking his boat, and I could already picture myself using it for my truck when I had company over, or maybe someday for an RV. The real estate agent made sure to point out that this extra space was clearly marked on the property survey as part of my lot. I had all the paperwork to prove it. My next-door neighbors seemed friendly enough during those first few weeks. The woman next door would wave when she saw me working in the yard, and her husband gave me a polite nod when he was getting his mail. They'd lived there for over 20 years according to the previous owner, and they definitely carried themselves like they knew the neighborhood inside and out. I figured having established neighbors would be a good thing, people who could tell me which trash company was reliable or where the best pizza place was. About 3 weeks after I moved in, I came home from a particularly long shift to find an unfamiliar black SUV parked right in the middle of my gravel patch. At first, I just stared at it through my windshield, confused. Maybe it was someone visiting another house who got turned around. The neighborhood had a few similar-looking driveways, so honest mistakes could happen. I decided to give it a day and see if it moved on its own. The SUV was gone the next morning, so I figured problem solved, but then it happened again a few days later, this time with a different car, a red sedan. I was coming back from the grocery store when I saw my neighbor and a young man I assumed was her son getting out of the red car that was parked squarely on my gravel patch. That's when it hit me that this wasn't a mistake at all. They were intentionally using my property as their personal overflow parking. I decided to handle it the neighborly way. The next evening, I saw the woman working in her garden and walked over with what I hoped was a friendly smile. I introduced myself properly and made small talk about how much I was enjoying the neighborhood. Then I brought up the parking situation as casually as I could manage. I explained that I'd noticed their family cars on my gravel area a couple of times and mentioned that I was planning to use that space myself, so I'd appreciate it if they could park on their own property or on the street going forward. I tried to keep my tone light and reasonable. Her response caught me completely off guard. She actually laughed and waved her hand dismissively. She told me not to worry about that little patch of dirt, saying the people who lived in my house before never cared about it. She explained that they'd been using it for parking when their kids visited for the past 20 years, and it was just easier for everyone that way. She finished by saying I'd get used to it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I walked away feeling frustrated, but hoping that my direct request would be enough to solve the problem. Maybe she just needed time to process that things were different now with a new owner. I was wrong. If anything, the parking got worse over the next few weeks. Now, whenever her adult children visited, which seemed to be every weekend, both of their cars would end up on my gravel patch. Sometimes one of them would park so far over that it partially blocked my main driveway, making it difficult for me to get my own truck in and out. The second time I approached her about it, I made sure to be more direct. I found her by her mailbox and told her firmly that this was my property and she needed to stop parking there. I used the word trespassing to make sure she understood the seriousness of the situation. That's when her true personality came out. Her whole demeanor changed and she got hostile fast. She demanded to know how I dared to make such a big deal out of this. She said they were good neighbors and that I was the one causing problems ever since I moved in. She called it a patch of dirt and told me to get over it. Her husband, who had wandered over during our conversation, jumped in to tell me to relax and that I didn't need to make a federal case out of it. They both tried to paint me as some aggressive newcomer who didn't understand how things worked in their neighborhood. I realized I needed to protect myself legally and show them I was serious. That weekend, I drove to the hardware store and bought the most professional-looking sign I could find. It was white with black lettering that clearly stated, "Private property, no parking, unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense." I installed it right at the edge of the gravel patch with a metal post, making sure it was visible from the street. For about a week, the sign seemed to work. No cars appeared on my property, and I started to think maybe we'd finally reached an understanding. Then came the weekend that changed everything. My neighbor was hosting what looked like a large family gathering. Cars were lined up along the street, and I could hear music and laughter coming from their backyard. I was actually happy for them. It sounded like everyone was having a good time. That positive feeling lasted until I looked out my front window and saw not one, not two, but 3 cars crammed onto my gravel patch, parked defiantly right in front of my new sign. One car was even parked partially on the grass next to the gravel, leaving tire tracks in my lawn. It was such a blatant act of disrespect that I actually stood there for a minute just processing what I was seeing. They weren't just ignoring my requests anymore, they were openly mocking them. The sign might as well have been invisible for all the attention they paid to it. I grabbed my phone and took multiple photos from different angles, making sure to capture the license plates, the sign, and the clear property boundaries. Then I went inside and pulled out the folder with all my house paperwork. I found my official property survey map and my deed, spreading them out on the kitchen table to double-check what I already knew. The gravel patch was unquestionably, legally, 100% my property. I looked up towing companies in the area and called the first one that advertised 24-hour service. I explained the situation calmly. Private residential property, clearly marked with no parking signs, unauthorized vehicles. The dispatcher confirmed they could remove the cars and that the owners would be responsible for all towing and storage fees. They said a truck would be there within the hour. While I waited, I positioned myself on my front porch with my property documents in hand. I wasn't hiding what was about to happen. If anything, I wanted to be visible and prepared for the conversation that was inevitably coming. The first tow truck arrived with its flashing yellow lights cutting through the early evening. The driver was professional and efficient, immediately hooking up the red sedan that was parked most obviously on my property. The noise and lights drew attention from the party next door, and I watched as people started spilling out of the backyard to see what was happening. My neighbor came charging out her front door like a woman possessed. She started screaming at the tow truck driver, demanding to know what he thought he was doing and threatening to call his company. The driver remained calm and professional, explaining that he was removing vehicles from private property at the owner's request and that she needed to step back for safety reasons. When she spotted me on my porch, her fury reached a whole new level. She started yelling that I was psycho and that she couldn't believe I would do something like this. She screamed that she was calling the cops on me for harassment and theft. Her party guests and family members had gathered around by this point, creating quite an audience for her meltdown. True to her word, she did call the police. I could hear her on the phone, sobbing and carrying on about her horrible new neighbor who was trying to ruin her family gathering by stealing her guests' cars. She was playing the victim card hard, and I had to admit I felt a moment of nervousness. What if the police didn't see it my way? 2 officers arrived just as the second tow truck was hooking up the black SUV. My neighbor immediately rushed over to them, tears streaming down her face as she painted me as some kind of monster who was terrorizing her family. She pointed dramatically at the tow trucks and sobbed about how I was destroying her party and traumatizing her grandchildren. One of the officers approached me and asked for my side of the story. I took a deep breath and explained the situation as calmly and factually as I could. I told him about the repeated requests I'd made, the sign I'd installed as a final warning, and how they'd ignored everything. Then I handed him my property survey map and deed. The officer examined the documents carefully, walked over to look at the property line markers, and then returned to where my neighbor was still crying to his partner. I watched his expression change from neutral mediator to someone who was about to lay down the law. He walked over to my neighbor and told her plainly that according to the official documents, this was not her land. He explained that I was well within my legal rights to have the vehicles towed and that she was actually the one trespassing. The change in my neighbor's face was something I'll never forget. She went from red with rage to pale with shock in about 2 seconds. The officer continued, explaining that not only were the cars being legally towed, but she and her guests were responsible for every dollar of the towing and impound fees, which would likely amount to several $100s per car. Her family and party guests had been watching this whole interaction, and you could feel the mood shift as they realized she was completely in the wrong. Some of them started looking embarrassed, others angry. Her husband tried to salvage the situation by offering to pay me for damages, but the officer cut him off, saying the legal process was already in motion. The third tow truck finished loading the last car, and all 3 vehicles were hauled away while my neighbor stood there in her own driveway looking absolutely devastated. The police officers gave her information about how to retrieve the cars and reminded her that any future parking on my property could result in additional towing and possible criminal trespassing charges. After everyone left, the neighborhood fell completely silent. The party was over. Through my window, I could see people gathering their things and leaving early. Cars that had been parked on the street started pulling away. My neighbor and her family spent the rest of their evening dealing with the expensive and humiliating consequences of their actions instead of celebrating together. The immediate aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. My neighbor and her husband stopped making eye contact when they saw me outside. The friendly waves were gone, replaced by obvious avoidance. But more importantly, no one ever parked on my gravel patch again, not once. The message had been received loud and clear. A few weeks later, I decided to make a permanent change to the space. I couldn't park there every day since I used my garage, so I wanted to do something that would make my ownership crystal clear while also improving the property. I spent a weekend building raised garden beds along the back edge of the gravel patch and planted them with vegetables and flowers. It looked great and served as a visual reminder of exactly where my property line was. The garden project actually led to some positive interactions with other neighbors who stopped by to compliment the landscaping. I learned that my immediate neighbors had always been a bit difficult and that most people on the street had their own stories about boundary issues or petty conflicts with them. Several people told me they were glad someone had finally stood up to them. Looking back on the whole situation, I never wanted a war with my neighbors. I just wanted to live peacefully on the property I'd worked so hard to buy. But I wasn't going to be bullied or taken advantage of either. When someone repeatedly ignores polite requests and clear warnings, sometimes the only language they understand is consequences. The legal route worked perfectly because I had documentation, I followed proper procedures, and I stayed calm throughout the process. My neighbor wanted to teach me my place as the newcomer to their neighborhood. Instead, I taught her the exact location of her property line. She hasn't forgotten that lesson since, and my garden has never looked better. These days, things are peaceful again. I wave to the neighbors I've gotten to know, tend my garden, and enjoy my house without any parking drama. The gravel patch serves its intended purpose when I need extra space, and the garden beds have become a source of pride. Sometimes standing up for yourself is uncomfortable in the moment, but it's worth it for the long-term peace of mind. I've learned that being a good neighbor doesn't mean being a pushover. It means respecting boundaries, both literal and figurative. When someone shows you they won't respect reasonable requests, it's time to let the legal system and natural consequences do the talking. My property deed was worth more than any argument I could have made, and my neighbor learned that the hard way. Update: 6 months later, I thought the towing incident was the end of our parking wars, but life had a few more surprises in store. I'm writing this update because some pretty significant things have happened since my original post, and I figured you'd all want to hear how this story really ended. First off, my garden project became way more successful than I ever imagined. What started as a simple way to mark my territory turned into a legitimate hobby. The raised beds I built produced an amazing crop of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that summer. I ended up with so much produce that I started sharing it with the friendly neighbors, which really helped me build better relationships on the street. But the real developments came about 3 months after the towing incident. I was working in my garden one Saturday morning when I noticed a for sale sign go up in my problematic neighbor's front yard. At first, I felt a little bad. Had our conflict really driven them to sell their house? But then I talked to Mrs. Johnson, who lives across the street, and she filled me in on what had really been happening. Turns out, my neighbors had been having serious financial problems for over a year. The husband had lost his job at the plant about 18 months ago and had been struggling to find steady work. They'd been behind on their mortgage payments and had actually received foreclosure notices. The wife had been picking up extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, but it wasn't enough to cover their bills. Mrs. Johnson explained that they'd been planning to sell for months, but kept putting it off, hoping things would turn around. The towing incident and the several $100s they had to pay in fees to get their cars back was apparently the final straw that forced them to face reality. They simply couldn't afford to stay in the house anymore. This information completely changed how I felt about the whole situation. Don't get me wrong, they were still in the wrong for parking on my property and being so hostile about it, but understanding that they were dealing with serious financial stress made their behavior make more sense. Desperation can make people act in ways they normally wouldn't. About a week after the sign went up, I was surprised to see the wife at my front door. She looked tired and defeated, nothing like the angry woman who had screamed at me during the towing incident. She asked if we could talk, and I invited her to sit on my porch. She started by apologizing for everything that had happened. She admitted they'd been wrong to park on my property, and especially wrong to be so nasty about it when I asked them to stop. She explained about their financial situation and said the stress had been making both of them behave badly toward everyone, not just me. Then she asked if I might be interested in buying their house. They were hoping to find a buyer who wouldn't need to go through a lengthy mortgage process, and she knew I'd recently bought my place, so I might have connections with real estate people or investors. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to get involved in their personal drama. However, something she said stuck with me. She mentioned that if they had to go through foreclosure, they'd lose everything they'd put into the house over 20 years, including all the improvements they'd made. I spent the next few days thinking about it and doing some research. Their house was actually in great shape, with a newer roof, updated electrical, and a beautiful kitchen remodel. The asking price was fair for the neighborhood, maybe even a little low because they needed to sell quickly. I ended up talking to my cousin who works in real estate investment. He was very interested and came out to look at the property the following week. After getting an inspection done, he made a cash offer that was slightly below asking price, but still fair given their situation. My neighbors accepted immediately. The whole process moved incredibly fast. They were able to close within 3 weeks and avoid foreclosure. I helped connect them with a moving company that gave them a good rate, and they ended up relocating to a smaller town about 2 hours away where the husband had found steady work. Before they left, both of them stopped by to thank me. The wife brought me a plate of homemade cookies and a card that apologized again for their behavior. She said they realized how lucky they were that I hadn't held grudges and had actually helped them out of a terrible situation. The husband shook my hand and admitted he'd been embarrassed about their financial problems and had taken his frustration out on me unfairly. It was actually a pretty emotional conversation. They'd lived in that house for over 20 years and raised their kids there. Leaving wasn't easy, but they seemed relieved to have a fresh start somewhere they could afford. My cousin ended up keeping the house as a rental property. The new tenants are a young couple with a baby who are absolutely delightful. They introduced themselves the day they moved in, complimented my garden, and asked if I had any advice about the neighborhood. The contrast with my previous neighbors couldn't have been more obvious. The really interesting part came about a month after the new tenants moved in. I was chatting with them over the fence when they mentioned something strange they'd discovered. When they were setting up their garage, they found a pile of old survey documents and property records that the previous owners had left behind. Looking through those papers, we discovered that my former neighbors had actually been in a boundary dispute with the people who lived in my house before me. There were letters back and forth with a surveyor and even some legal correspondence about property lines. It turned out that the previous owner of my house had been letting them park on the gravel patch as part of an informal agreement to avoid a costly legal battle over a completely different boundary issue on the other side of their property. This explained so much about their behavior. They weren't just being entitled. They genuinely believed they had some kind of right to use that space based on the informal arrangement with the previous owner. Of course, that arrangement died when the property was sold to me, but they'd convinced themselves it was permanent. Looking back, I wish I'd known about this history earlier. It might have helped me understand their perspective and maybe find a better solution. Then again, even if they felt they had historical precedent, their hostile response to my polite requests was still completely inappropriate. The discovery also made me appreciate even more how important it was that I had all my paperwork in order. Property rights can be complicated, and having clear documentation was what protected me when things got messy. These days, my relationship with the neighborhood is better than ever. The new tenants next door are fantastic. My garden expanded into a second set of raised beds, and I'm planning to add a small greenhouse next spring. Several neighbors have asked for advice on starting their own vegetable gardens, and we've talked about organizing a neighborhood garden tour next summer. I've also become friends with Mrs. Johnson, who turned out to be a wealth of information about local history and neighborhood dynamics. She's lived here for 30 years and has seen families come and go. According to her, every few years there's some kind of boundary dispute or neighbor conflict that gets everyone worked up, but it usually resolves itself eventually. The most surprising development happened just last month. I got a Christmas card in the mail from my former neighbors. They'd settled into their new town and were doing much better financially. The husband had gotten a promotion at his new job, and they'd been able to buy a small house with a big yard where they're planning to start their own garden. In the card, they thanked me again for helping them sell their house quickly and said they hoped I was enjoying the neighborhood. They even included a photo of their new place, which looked lovely. It was a nice reminder that people can change and that conflicts don't have to define relationships forever. I've been thinking a lot about what I learned from this whole experience. The obvious lesson is about standing up for your property rights and not letting people take advantage of you. But the deeper lesson is about how financial stress, pride, and miscommunication can turn ordinary people into temporary enemies. If I had to do it over again, I think I would have tried to get more background information earlier. Maybe if I'd understood their financial situation and the history with the previous owner, we could have worked out some kind of temporary arrangement while they got back on their feet. Then again, their hostile response to my initial polite requests made dialogue pretty much impossible. The towing incident was still the right call given the circumstances. Sometimes you have to enforce boundaries firmly before people will take you seriously, but I'm glad the story ended with reconciliation rather than permanent bad blood. My property is worth more now than when I bought it, partly because of the improvements I've made, but also because the neighborhood has become more desirable. Having good relationships with your neighbors definitely adds value, both financial and personal. The gravel patch still serves its intended purpose when I need extra parking, but most of the time it's just a nice space that opens up my yard. The garden beds frame it beautifully and have become a real source of pride. Last month I won second place in the Neighborhood Association's garden contest, which felt like a nice validation of all the work I put in. I keep the no parking sign up, more out of principle than necessity at this point. It's faded a bit from the weather, but it serves as a reminder of how important clear communication and firm boundaries can be. Sometimes new people ask me about the sign and I tell them the whole story. Most people are amazed at how it all worked out in the end. It's become one of those neighborhood legends that gets passed around at block parties and community events. Looking forward, I'm just grateful to have found my place in this community. Home ownership has been everything I hoped it would be, and more. I've got good neighbors, a beautiful garden, and the satisfaction of knowing I can handle whatever challenges come my way. The experience taught me that being a good neighbor means respecting boundaries and standing up for yourself when necessary, but also being open to understanding other people's perspectives and helping when you can. It's a balance, but it's worth finding. And yes, my garden really has never looked better. The next one is a pro-revenge story. My former boss is the worst human being I've ever met. He did all sorts of things to mess with anyone he didn't like. So a while ago I was at a family event in a local park, walking with a young boy from our family who is developmentally disabled with Down syndrome, Ben. Ben does fairly well all things considered, but he's always been sensitive to anyone making fun of the way he looks or his condition. We were just having a good time on our little stroll, Ben and I both enjoying the day. Along comes my boss walking toward us. I'll call him Rob. I cringe at seeing him, but smile and say hello to play nice. Rob, there's something you don't see every day. A pair of ugly retards walking together. Ben bursts into tears as Rob laughs and walks off. I deal with Ben and ignore Rob. I'm super pissed and trying to calm Ben down because for a few minutes he was totally distraught. Finally, I get Ben to focus on how he has me and a lot of other awesome friends and family and that Rob is a stranger and what he thinks doesn't matter. We walked some more, and I saw that Rob was at the park with his wife and teen daughter having a cookout, and he had apparently been on his way back to his family from a trip to the toilet when he saw us. Back to being super pissed. I went back to our gathering and talked to an adult cousin of mine, Jake, telling him what happened. Jake wanted to get revenge on Rob, but I reminded him that this was my boss. I didn't want Rob to be able to know the revenge had anything to do with me because then he'd make my work life even worse than he already had. So Jake asked me for anything I knew about Rob that might help. I told Jake a bunch of things about Rob, but the relevant info here is that Rob liked to drink a particular kind of locally made beer at a certain bar. Rob had talked of having drank there on the previous Friday night while his wife and daughter were away visiting her family. Also, Rob had recently told a story at work about his wife's obsession with a particular little green fictional character. Let's call it Yabi Boda. Turns out his wife kept a stuffed Yabi Boda on their bed at all times. I wasn't there for the revenge setup itself because I didn't want Rob to see me, but Jake filled in the details afterward. It was basically this. Jake approached Rob and put an arm around his shoulders and tried to kiss him. Rob pushes him off. Rob, what are you doing? Rob's family is now paying attention. Jake, I am just so excited to see you, sweetie. Friday night was so amazing. Rob, what are you talking about? Jake, seriously, you're going to act like you don't remember now? I know you were a bit tipsy after all of those specific local beers at the local bar, but certainly you remember what happened later. Rob, nothing happened later or ever. I don't even know your name. Jake, really? You were screaming it on Friday. Rob, turning red. You lying son of a... Rob's wife, interrupting. Listen, I don't know who you are, but this is my husband. I'm sure you have him mistaken for someone else. Please just leave us alone. Jake. Oh no, I'm not mistaken. We had the best sex ever on Friday night, and now he's acting like he doesn't even know me. Rob's wife. I told you this is my husband. You're mistaken. Jake. Oh, maybe I am. I guess it was someone else who took me back to his place on Rob Street and had great sex with me on the bed right next to Yabi Boda. Sorry. Jake turns and walks away. Rob's wife. Oh my god, Rob, WTF is wrong with you? You're gay now? Really? Already, long story made a bit shorter, Rob's wife wasn't real happy with him anyway, and this was apparently the tipping point that made her file for divorce soon thereafter. Rob frequently complained at work in the following months about how he didn't care about his wife, but really missed his daughter and how much it sucked to live in his new place compared to his old home. Every time he complained about his lack of a home life at work, I knew he did it to himself when he was mean to a developmentally disabled kid. The best part is, he never figured out I was involved at all. The next one is an entitled people story. So, yesterday's story of Karen and her tour prices from some random blog was quite well received, so I shall endeavor to tell you the tale of another encounter I have had with one of the very same species at another occasion. This story takes place sometime around 2016 plus, a year or two, it's not really important. I was working for a hotel in northern Sweden as a guide. I did all sorts of different tours, including snowmobiling, and for this particular adventure I did a snowmobile tour in the evening with the aim of finding a good spot to see the northern lights, also known as the aurora. This was sometime in the middle of the season, and I had been out with a group of people on the snowmobiles the previous night, and we had great weather with lots of clear sky and amazing views, and we did see a bit of aurora as well. Nothing spectacular, but what I would describe as slightly above average aurora. It was clearly visible to the naked eye, and you could tell it was slowly shifting across the sky, and of course it showed up great in pictures like it usually does. During the tour, all seemed well. I had half a dozen or so guests with me, and nothing or particular note happened. Nobody crashed the snowmobiles, got stuck in deep snow. Nobody was particularly cold or anything like it. Little did I know of the adventure that was awaiting the next day. The next day, I was in the hotel reception talking to the owner and manager of said hotel, who also happens to do a lot of reception work and was thus the receptionist of the day. I had already told him the tour had gone well, and we had seen some decent auroras and showed a couple of pictures. I don't remember what we were talking about when Karen walks into the reception. She didn't have the haircut, but she did certainly have the attitude. She starts off nice and calm with telling the owner she wants to talk about the tour last night. Here follows a rough synopsis of what was said. K. The aurora, it wasn't as green as I expected it to be. M. Okay, well, it can sometimes be hard to see the color with the naked eye. K. But his wasn't that green, pointing at a picture on the wall. M. Okay, well, as I said, it can sometimes be hard to see the color. K. So, what are we going to do about this? M. Now looking visibly confused. Do about what? K. The tour, it was very disappointing. M. But you did get to see the aurora and you got to drive the snowmobiles and the weather was nice. K. But it wasn't that green. I want to have a refund. M. No, you got the tour you paid for. You will not get a refund. Well, let's just say that this didn't sit too well with Karen. At this point, I also decide to enter the conversation since I am a bit better with explaining these things to people. Anyway, I explained the physics of the aurora and that it is in fact always exactly the same green. Well, that fell on deaf ears. Next thing, I explained that our perception of the aurora varies from person to person depending on how sensitive your eyes are to certain wavelengths of light, and that two people can have a very different experience seeing the same thing. Well, now I was apparently insinuating that she was blind or something. I also explained that the white balance and other settings in the camera, as well as the printing process, can make pictures look quite different, pointing at several other pictures around the reception with various different shades of green. Well, that was like pouring water on a duck. She still insisted that the one particular picture that was hanging next to the receptionist that happened to depict a particularly bright aurora, and that also was a quite vibrant green, was false marketing since she did not see that. Then it happens she loses it and starts shouting she wants to talk to the manager because we are both useless. Well, the managed promptly tells her that he is in fact the manager and he is still not going to give her a refund. But Karen will not go down so easily. She next demands to talk to the owner. Surely the owner will see things her way and punish us and give her the refund and general respect she rightfully deserves. Well, I did mention before the manager is also the owner of the hotel. Let's just say Karen was not pleased to hear that little piece of news. At this point, she is desperate and just keeps angrily telling both of us that she is disappointed in the tour, she wants a refund, we have very poor service, and like a broken record, she keeps saying the same thing again and again for a solid 30 minutes before the manager tells her to leave or he will throw her out. I am pretty sure she threatened to report us to the police for false marketing a few times as well. The owner ends with just telling her good luck with your lawsuit after she promises to sue us while stomping out. As we were standing there flabbergasted by the sheer guts of this lady, a couple that was sitting in the back of the reception comes out from behind the corner and asks if we get many crazy people like her. Turns out they were also one of the people on my tour the night before. We all had a good laugh at Karen's expense. She checked out the same day, so we didn't see much more of her than her stomping up to the train station with her presumed husband in tow carrying all the luggage. With some people going above and beyond it not enough, we should apparently have changed the laws of physics to make the aurora the green she was expecting. Or perhaps we should have spiked her lingonberry juice with something to make the colors brighter. Who knows? But at the end of the day, it's a funny story to tell people. Anyway, thank you for watching.